What if the greatest medical breakthroughs of the 20th century were born in places where medicine forgot what it meant to heal? Beneath the white coats and microscopes of the Third Reich, science turned into the coldest weapon of all, the experiment on humanity itself. The origins of Nazi medical experimentation can be traced back to the intellectual and institutional developments of interwar Germany, when science and ideology began to merge under the framework of state-directed research. The collapse of the German Empire in 1918 and the subsequent social unrest of the Weimar Republic produced a climate of instability that made scientific nationalism attractive to many academics. Medicine, which had long been regarded as a symbol of German precision and discipline, became increasingly entangled with political goals. By the early 1930s, leading figures in genetics, psychiatry, and anthropology were advocating theories of racial hygiene that sought to apply biological principles to social policy. The idea that the health of the nation could be improved through selective breeding and sterilization gained legitimacy in scientific and political circles alike. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, this convergence of ideology and science found its institutional home in the Nazi state. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, enacted that same year, authorized compulsory sterilization for individuals diagnosed with conditions such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, and congenital blindness. Within a decade, over 400,000 people had been sterilized under its provisions. The policy was justified as a scientific measure to protect the genetic health of the population, reflecting the broader principle that medicine should serve the collective body of the Volk rather than the individual patient. Medical professionals played a central role in implementing these programs, forming special courts to decide who would be sterilized. The restructuring of German research institutions further reinforced this ideological alignment. Universities, professional associations, and state laboratories were reorganized to serve the goals of the Reich. The Kaiser Wilhelm Society, one of the most prestigious scientific organizations in Europe, became deeply involved in racial research, anthropology, and eugenics. Institutes such as the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin conducted studies aimed at defining and classifying racial categories. Their findings informed the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which codified racial hierarchy into the legal system and laid the groundwork for later programs of exclusion and extermination. The outbreak of war in 1939 transformed this system of ideological medicine into one of systematic experimentation. The military conflict created unprecedented opportunities for research on human subjects. German doctors, supported by the SS and the Wehrmacht, were given access to populations considered expendable: prisoners, concentration camp inmates, and occupied civilians. Medical ethics, already subordinated to ideology, were replaced by utilitarian arguments of necessity. Experiments were justified as contributions to the survival of soldiers, pilots, and the nation itself. Research into hypothermia, altitude, infectious diseases, and new pharmaceuticals was presented as essential to the war effort. At the same time, the boundaries between scientific curiosity and political indoctrination disappeared. Organizations such as the SS Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Heritage Research Division, sponsored medical and anthropological projects that combined pseudoscientific theories with political objectives. Doctors who had once worked in universities now found themselves serving as officers, conducting experiments under the guise of military necessity. Camp laboratories were established at Dachau, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz, each specializing in different areas of study. The SS provided the facilities and human subjects. The medical institutions provided expertise and documentation. This fusion of science, ideology, and state power created an environment where cruelty was redefined as experimentation. The process was not driven solely by orders from above, but by a shared sense of purpose among participants who believed they were advancing knowledge and serving the nation. Many of the scientists involved considered their work legitimate research, conducted within the logic of wartime necessity. Others saw it as an opportunity for professional advancement in a system that rewarded loyalty and results. By 1941, as the war expanded eastward, the ideological framework of Nazi medicine reached its most radical expression. The same doctors who had administered sterilizations and euthanasia within Germany were now involved in mass killings under the code name Action T4. This program, which targeted individuals deemed life unworthy of life, was both a continuation and an escalation of earlier eugenic policies. The medical infrastructure developed for euthanasia, gas chambers, selection procedures, medical documentation, would later be replicated on a much larger scale in the extermination camps of occupied Poland. Thus, the preconditions for Nazi medical experiments were not born in the chaos of war, but in decades of intellectual preparation and institutional complicity. The transformation of medicine from a healing profession into an instrument of ideology did not occur overnight. It evolved through bureaucratic normalization, scientific justification, and political alignment. By the time the first human experiments began in the camps, the framework for their justification, the subordination of individual rights to the collective health of the nation, was already firmly in place. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 provided the conditions under which Nazi medical experimentation expanded from domestic eugenics into systematic research on captive populations. The German military's rapid conquests created vast territories under occupation, supplying the regime with millions of prisoners of war, deportees, and concentration camp inmates. Within this new geography of control, medicine became both a weapon and a tool of policy. Hospitals, universities, and military laboratories were drawn into the war effort, and the boundaries between clinical research and political experimentation disappeared. The health of the German soldier and the racial future of the German nation became twin justifications for a range of studies that increasingly treated human life as a variable in scientific calculation. One of the earliest phases of wartime experimentation involved the continuation of the euthanasia program, known as Action T4, which had begun 1939. Conducted under the supervision of the Chancellery of the Führer, this program targeted the mentally ill and physically disabled, groups considered useless eaters within the framework of racial hygiene. Physicians serving in psychiatric institutions across Germany and Austria compiled reports that determined who would live and who would die. By 1941, an estimated 70,000 people had been killed in gas chambers disguised as showers using carbon monoxide. Although the public outcry led to the official suspension of T4 in August 1941, its personnel, methods, and equipment were later transferred to the extermination camps in occupied Poland. Parallel to these killings, the military demanded new forms of medical research to support combat operations. The Luftwaffe initiated projects to study the physiological limits of pilots and soldiers. At Dachau concentration camp, doctors such as Siegmund Rascher conducted high-altitude experiments using decompression chambers to simulate the conditions experienced by aviators. Subjects, mostly prisoners, were exposed to rapid changes in air pressure to determine how long a pilot could survive at extreme altitudes. In related hypothermia studies, inmates were submerged in ice water for extended periods to test rewarming methods for downed airmen. The results were reported to the German Air Ministry and presented as essential data for saving the lives of soldiers at the front. Though SS and Wehrmacht also sponsored experiments on infectious diseases. At Buchenwald, concentration camp inmates were deliberately infected with typhus to test the efficacy of new vaccines produced by companies such as Behringwerk and AIG Farben. These studies were conducted under the supervision of Erwin Ding Schuler, who maintained meticulous records of infections, deaths, and supposed immunities. Similar tests occurred at Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler-Struthof, where camp laboratories became extensions of Germany's wartime pharmaceutical industry. The collaboration between private corporations and SS medical officers demonstrated how the war blurred distinctions between state research and commercial enterprise. In occupied territories, the intersection of racial policy and military necessity generated additional opportunities for experimentation. The SS Ahnenerbe and the Institute for Military Scientific Research coordinated a network of field laboratories to study nutrition, resistance to disease, and the effects of environmental conditions on different racial types. Anthropologists and physicians carried out measurements and blood sampling on prisoners of war, civilians, and concentration camp inmates. In Auschwitz, the anthropologist Joseph Mengele combined eugenics and genetics by conducting twin studies aimed at understanding hereditary traits and physical differences. His meticulous documentation of physiological features served both pseudoscientific goals and ideological propaganda that sought to prove racial hierarchies. By 1942, the medical experiments had expanded in scope and coordination. The SS centralized control through the Reich Main Office for Economic and Administrative Affairs, ensuring standardized reporting and the exchange of results among camps. Conferences of leading doctors were organized to discuss findings and future projects, often attended by figures who would later face trial at Nuremberg. At the same time, new areas of research emerged: the testing of chemical warfare agents, the study of bone regeneration and transplantation, and experiments on sterilization techniques. These projects were often designed to serve post-war ambitions of population control and territorial colonization in the East. Although the researchers often justified their work as contributing to the health of German troops or to the advancement of science, the conditions under which the experiments took place contradicted any claim to legitimate medical ethics. Prisoners were deprived of anesthesia, subjected to repeated procedures, and frequently died from infection, exhaustion, or deliberate execution. Records reveal that doctors treated these deaths not as tragedies but as data points in experimental reports. The bureaucratic precision with which results were recorded reflected the broader technocratic mentality of the regime, that suffering could be quantified and rationalized in pursuit of state objectives. The transformation of concentration camps into centers of medical research marked a turning point in the relationship between science and power under National Socialism. What began as an ideological commitment to racial purity had evolved into a vast apparatus of experimentation that combined the resources of the military, academia, and industry. The scientists involved were not acting as isolated extremists, but as members of professional networks integrated into the structures of the Reich. Their work, carried out under the banner of national necessity, laid the foundation for what would later be described as one of the most systematic violations of medical ethics in modern history. By 1942, Nazi medical experimentation had evolved into an organized, state-supported system with defined hierarchies, funding mechanisms, and research priorities. The Reich's leadership recognized that the war offered both a cover and a justification for activities that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Research proposals passed through bureaucratic channels that legitimized them within the framework of the German war economy. Scientists, physicians, and industrial representatives met in conferences to coordinate studies that ranged from battlefield medicine to racial biology. This structure transformed what had begun as scattered, ideologically driven experiments into a systematic program of applied human testing. The coordination of research within the SS was formalized under the authority of Heinrich Himmler, who regarded medicine as an instrument for both racial policy and military strategy. The SS Hygiene Institute, established in 1940, served as the central hub for experiments on infectious diseases and sterilization methods. Its divisions operated laboratories at Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, where medical officers carried out research commissioned by the Wehrmacht and pharmaceutical companies. The chain of command placed civilian scientists in direct collaboration with SS officers, linking the academic world to the concentration camp system through a network of contracts and research grants. Funding for these projects came from multiple sources, including the Reich Research Council, the German Red Cross, and private industry. Pharmaceutical firms such as Bayer, Behring Werke, and Schering supplied drugs and vaccines, using the camps as testing grounds for new products. These arrangements blurred the boundary between state policy and corporate interest. Companies provided materials and technical expertise, while the SS supplied test subjects. Reports from Buchenwald indicate that each phase of typhus vaccine testing involved between 600 and 1,200 prisoners, with mortality rates exceeding 50%. The resulting data, though obtained through lethal means, were circulated among German medical institutions and published in internal bulletins. At Dachau, research expanded beyond the early aviation and hypothermia studies. The camp became a testing site for chemical warfare protection and for treatments against malaria, which posed a persistent problem for German troops fighting in southern Europe. Under the supervision of Klaus Schilling, a tropical disease specialist, prisoners were infected with malaria parasites and given experimental treatments with quinine substitutes. Over 1,000 subjects were used, many dying of complications or from the toxicity of untested drugs. Schilling's meticulous notes on dosages, reactions, and autopsy results were later presented as scientific contributions to military medicine. The SS also pursued sterilization research as part of its demographic strategy for the occupied territories. Doctors such as Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann conducted experiments at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück to develop mass sterilization techniques that could be applied to entire populations deemed racially inferior. Klauberg's method involved injecting caustic chemicals into the uterus to cause scarring of the fallopian tubes, while Schumann tested radiation exposure to achieve similar results in men. These procedures were carried out on hundreds of women and men without anesthesia, often leading to infection, mutilation, or death. The aim was not therapeutic, but administrative, to find efficient means of population control for future colonizations plans in Eastern Europe. By this period, the structure of medical experimentation reflected the broader logic of Nazi governance. Decentralization combined with ideological uniformity. Camp commandants granted autonomy to medical officers as long as their projects aligned with the objectives of the Reich. The flow of reports and correspondence between camps reveals a professionalized language that concealed violence behind technical terminology. In documents, the term Versuchspersonen, experimental subjects, replaced prisoners, and final observation signified death. Scientific progress was measured in the number of procedures completed and the speed of data collection. Beyond Germany's borders, military necessity provided new rationales for human experimentation. On the Eastern Front, doctors attached to the Wehrmacht and SS units conducted field research on frostbite, wound infection, and gangrene. Prisoners and civilians were used to test debridement methods and antiseptic compounds. In occupied Poland, the Institute for Hygiene of the Waffen-SS collaborated with local universities in Krakow and Lviv, conscripting Polish doctors and medical students to assist in studies conducted under duress. The occupied territories thus became extensions of the Reich's biomedical frontier, where the combination of racial ideology and wartime pragmatism removed any remaining ethical restraints. In parallel, the euthanasia program evolved into a training ground for personnel who would later participate in camp experiments. Doctors and nurses from institutions such as Hartheim and Hadamar were reassigned to concentration camps, bringing with them experience in systematic killing and documentation. The same medical infrastructure, including gas chambers, crematoria, and selection protocols, was adapted to the needs of both extermination and experimentation. This continuity between the T4 program and later research projects demonstrated that Nazi medicine was not an aberration, but an integral part of the regime's administrative logic. By the end of 1942, the network of medical experiments had become both self-sustaining and institutionalized. Research results were shared at scientific conferences attended by representatives of the Wehrmacht, SS, and industry. Papers on altitude physiology, blood coagulation, and vaccine development were circulated internally, framed as contributions to German medical advancement. Within the system, participation in such projects offered prestige, funding, and protection from military service. The scientists involved operated within a culture that equated innovation with loyalty and regarded ethical limitations as obstacles to progress. This phase marked the consolidation of what historians later termed applied ideology. Medicine had been fully absorbed into the structure of the totalitarian state, transforming the laboratory and the concentration camp into interconnected spaces of control. The language of health, efficiency, and progress concealed a reality defined by coercion, suffering, and death. a system that presented atrocity as experimentation and experimentation as science. By 1943, the medical experiments of the Reich entered a phase of full-scale institutionalization. What had once been framed as ad hoc projects tied to immediate wartime needs became a structured network of medical research directly coordinated by the SS, the Wehrmacht, and the Reich Research Council. At this stage, the experiments reached their greatest scale and diversity. They were no longer limited to disease control or pilot survival, but extended into genetics, surgery, and biochemical testing on human beings. The camps became laboratories for experimentation on a population viewed as a limitless supply of test subjects. The system now functioned with administrative efficiency, scientific language, and military precision. A key center of coordination was the SS Medical Department, directed by Reichsarzt SS Ernst Robert Grawitz. Under his oversight, the network connected major concentration camps with academic institutions and pharmaceutical corporations. A centralized reporting system ensured that data gathered at sites such as Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Natzweiler-Struthof were archived and circulated among Reich research facilities. Doctors working under Himmler's personal patronage submitted formal proposals for new projects, which were reviewed based on military value and racial significance. This bureaucratic process created a thin veneer of legality for actions that defied all norms of medical conduct. Among the most active projects in this period were those related to infectious disease control. At Buchenwald, typhus vaccine testing expanded to include parallel research on smallpox, tuberculosis, and diphtheria. The experiments used groups of prisoners divided into test and control categories. Inmates in the experimental group were injected with vaccines, while others were deliberately infected with virulent strains to assess immunity. Mortality rates were recorded in daily logs, and autopsies were performed to study organ pathology. The results, though scientifically inconsistent, were considered valuable by the Wehrmacht Medical Inspectorate, which distributed summaries to frontline medical units. At Ravensbrück, a camp for women, the surgical experiments led by Karl Gebhardt and Herta Oberheiser investigated bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration following traumatic injury. Prisoners were subjected to incisions, deliberate infections, and amputations to simulate battlefield wounds. The experiments were performed under unsanitary conditions, and most subjects suffered permanent disability or death. Gebhardt, who served as Himmler's personal physician and a senior SS officer, presented his findings at medical conferences in Berlin, claiming they contributed to the treatment of gangrene and osteomyelitis among German soldiers. His collaboration with surgeons from the Hohenleichen Sanatorium illustrates how mainstream institutions lent credibility to the work of SS doctors. Auschwitz remained the largest and most infamous center of experimentation. Here, research was carried out on genetics, sterilization, and racial classification. Joseph Mengele, an anthropologist and physician assigned to the camp, conducted twin studies aimed at identifying hereditary factors in disease and physical traits. Sets of twins, particularly children, were measured, photographed, and subjected to repeated medical procedures. When one twin died, the surviving sibling was often killed to allow comparative autopsies. The data were forwarded to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, where they were analyzed as part of broader studies on heredity and population policy. Other Auschwitz experiments involved testing sterilization methods using X-rays and chemicals, intended to develop mass techniques for population control in occupied territories. Or, parallel to these biological studies, chemical and pharmacological experiments were carried out in collaboration with Germany's industrial sector. IG Farben, one of the largest chemical conglomerates in Europe, built a factory near Auschwitz, Monowitz, to produce synthetic rubber, Buna, and chemicals. The company also sponsored tests of experimental drugs, including sulfonamides and anesthetics, on prisoners. In these trials, wounds were deliberately infected with bacteria to evaluate drug efficacy. Mortality was high, but the results were transmitted to corporate laboratories for further refinement. The SS received payments for providing test subjects, creating a direct financial link between industrial profit and human experimentation. As Allied bombing intensified, the Luftwaffe expanded research into survival in extreme conditions. At Dachau, tests on freezing and saltwater consumption continued, focusing on methods for rescuing pilots downed in cold seas. Prisoners were placed in ice water for hours while physicians recorded their pulse, respiration, and brain activity. Subsequent rewarming attempts included immersion in hot water, body heat from other prisoners, and forced consumption of heated liquids. The scientific data were analyzed for potential use in pilot training manuals. These findings, later discovered by Allied investigators, were used as evidence of the systematic abuse of scientific rationality for military ends. The ethical boundaries of medicine had by then collapsed completely within the Reich's scientific establishment. Professional associations such as the German Medical Society and the Reich Chamber of Physicians continued to operate, publishing journals that occasionally referenced data from SS experiments without disclosing their sources. Medical education in universities incorporated elements of racial hygiene, presenting the concept of biological defense as part of national health. The coexistence of academic legitimacy and camp brutality reflected the degree to which ideological conformity had replaced ethical restraint. By 1944, the administrative apparatus of experimentation was deeply entrenched. Proposals flowed through the SS chain of command, reports circulated among military and civilian institutions, and results were archived systematically. The convergence of the state, the army, and private industry ensured that these projects continued even as Germany's military situation deteriorated. What had begun as research for the health of the nation had become a machinery of destruction, operating under the banner of science, sustained by ideology, profit, and bureaucratic efficiency. By 1944, as the Third Reich faced mounting military defeats, its medical experimentation apparatus reached an unprecedented level of brutality and scope. The loss of territory, the intensification of Allied bombing, and the breakdown of the German supply network created new research needs for the Nazi state. The leadership demanded solutions to battlefield injuries, infectious diseases, and the effects of malnutrition, and the concentration camps provided the human material to pursue these objectives. The fusion of desperation and ideology turned scientific inquiry into an instrument of destruction. For the SS, experimentation was no longer only about innovation. It was a means of asserting control, preserving power, and demonstrating the continued vitality of the Reich's racial and military vision, even in its decline. The year began with the consolidation of the SS medical hierarchy. Himmler personally approved the establishment of a central medical research division within the Waffen-SS, responsible for coordinating all ongoing projects across the camp system. Reports from this period show a growing emphasis on efficiency and documentation. The experiments were logged, categorized, and photographed for record-keeping, creating a body of evidence that combined scientific precision with administrative detachment. The systematic character of these records, filled with charts, anatomical sketches, and death counts, reflected the industrial logic of the Nazi state, where research and mass murder coexisted within the same bureaucratic framework. At Ravensbrück, surgical experiments continued with renewed intensity. The sulfonamide trials, originally designed to test antibacterial drugs for battlefield use, expanded to include procedures intended to replicate combat wounds. Women prisoners, often selected from newly arrived transports, were subjected to deliberate cuts, fractures, and infections using soil and splinters to mimic contaminated injuries. Researchers monitored the spread of infection, the effects of different antiseptics, and the rate of gangrene development. The majority of participants died during or shortly after the procedures. Survivors were often executed when their condition rendered them unable to work. Reports of these trials were circulated to senior medical officers, who considered them valuable contributions to military surgery. At Natzweiler-Struthof, in occupied France, the SS used the camp's gas chamber for chemical warfare experiments. Prisoners, primarily from Eastern Europe, were exposed to phosgene and mustard gas in varying concentrations to test decontamination techniques and the effectiveness of protective ointments. Similar studies were conducted at Sachsenhausen and Neuengamme. The Luftwaffe's involvement in these tests illustrates how cooperation between military branches and the SS blurred institutional boundaries. Military doctors sought practical applications for the results, while SS researchers viewed the projects as opportunities to demonstrate their scientific competence to the regime's leadership. Meanwhile, at Buchenwald, research expanded into virology and vaccine development. Prisoners were deliberately infected with hepatitis, typhus, and tuberculosis under controlled conditions. New drug compounds provided by Bayer and Schering were tested for their ability to prevent infection or reduce symptoms. Inmates were assigned identification numbers, and their progress was documented daily. Deaths were recorded as negative outcomes. These trials not only served pharmaceutical development, but also supplied data for the Reich Health Office, which integrated the results into official wartime medical reports. The seamless integration of lethal human testing into state health policy underscores the extent to which moral boundaries had been systematically dismantled. In Auschwitz, sterilization and genetic research reached their peak. Karl Klauberg, continuing his work on chemical sterilization, intensified his tests on female prisoners. His reports described the success rate of uterine scarring achieved by injecting caustic compounds into the reproductive organs. Each experiment was catalogued as a procedure, reducing human suffering to numerical efficiency. Simultaneously, Joseph Mengelé's twin studies grew more complex. His work shifted from simple physical measurements to invasive operations designed to trace hereditary similarities in internal organs. Children were anesthetized for comparative surgeries. When one died, the second was immediately killed for autopsy. Mengelé's correspondence with the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute reveals how his experiments were viewed not as aberrations, but as contributions to the study of heredity. Research intended to serve future generations of a racially pure Germany. In Dachau, high-altitude, hypothermia, and seawater experiments continued until late 1944. New tests sought to determine whether seawater could be made drinkable using chemical additives. Prisoners were deprived of food and fresh water for days, forced to drink chemically treated seawater, and monitored for organ failure. The experiments were commissioned by the Luftwaffe's medical division, which hoped to develop survival kits for downed pilots. The data, gathered through suffering and death, were presented at military medical conferences as legitimate findings. By this stage, the rationale behind Nazi medical experimentation was collapsing under its own contradictions. The Reich's defeat was increasingly evident, but its scientific apparatus persisted as though detached from reality. Even as front lines crumbled, new projects were proposed and approved. Researchers spoke of post-war applications and scientific reconstruction after victory, revealing how deeply they believed in the regime's survival. The institutional machine, with its forms, funding, and hierarchies, continued to function even as the society it served disintegrated. Throughout 1944, evidence also emerged of growing disillusionment among some participants. A few doctors expressed unease or attempted to distance themselves from the most extreme practices, though none mounted effective resistance. Their objections were procedural, not moral, focused on scientific reliability or resource allocation rather than the ethics of human testing. Others saw opportunity amid chaos, seeking promotions and recognition before the war's end. The collapse of external accountability allowed the system to perpetuate itself without restraint. By early 1945, as the Red Army advanced and the Western Allies crossed into Germany, the SS began destroying files and transferring personnel from experimental sites to the interior. Yet, even in its final months, the regime continued its medical projects, transporting equipment and data to makeshift laboratories in Bavaria and Austria. The machinery of experimentation, sustained by ideology, bureaucracy, and ambition, persisted until the very threshold of collapse, a testament to how deeply cruelty had been institutionalized within the structure of science under the Third Reich. As 1945 unfolded, The final months of the Reich saw the disintegration of its military front lines, but not the collapse of its scientific machinery. The network of medical experimentation, refined and institutionalized over years of war, continued to operate even as the regime itself disintegrated. Camps were evacuated, files were burned, and laboratories were dismantled. Yet the experiments persisted in fragments, conducted by physicians who still considered their work essential to the future of Germany or to their personal survival. The final phase of Nazi medical research was marked by chaos, secrecy, and a desperate attempt to preserve data and reputations as Allied forces closed in from all sides. At Dachau, which remained a functioning research site until April 1945, ongoing projects included freezing, hypothermia, and seawater trials. Researchers documented their results in coded reports and attempted to transfer these documents to Munich, fearing their discovery by the advancing U.S. Army. Surviving correspondence shows that several SS doctors requested permission to continue their experiments under civilian administration after the war, proposing to integrate their data into post-war German medicine. Some even appealed to the Red Cross and neutral scientific organizations, claiming humanitarian motives for their studies. These appeals reveal how deeply many of the perpetrators viewed themselves not as criminals, but as professionals preserving the value of their research. In Buchenwald, typhus vaccine experiments were still ongoing as the camp's liberation approached. The laboratory, overseen by Erwin Ding-Schuler, maintained its routines until the final days. As Allied forces advanced, Ding-Schuler and his staff attempted to destroy samples, burn records, and liquidate surviving test subjects to conceal evidence. However, the camp's resistance network, which included prisoners working in the laboratory, secretly preserved documents detailing the experiments. These records later formed a crucial foundation for post-war investigations. The data revealed systematic testing on hundreds of inmates, with death rates often exceeding 70%, and detailed cooperation with private firms such as Behringwerke and IG Farben. Auschwitz, liberated by the Red Army in January 1945, presented investigators with the most extensive evidence of medical crimes. Laboratories filled with specimens, photographs, and anatomical samples illustrated the scale of Mengelé's and Klauberg's research. Medical instruments, X-ray devices, and surgical records were found alongside lists of experimental subjects. Soviet medical commissions cataloged the materials, providing early documentation for what would later become part of the Nuremberg evidence. Mengele himself fled westward before the arrival of Soviet troops, taking with him thousands of pages of research notes and personal correspondence. His escape ensured that much of his data, particularly the genetic and twin studies, disappeared into post-war obscurity. In Ravensbrück, as the front approached, the SS began evacuating prisoners and transferring research materials to the north. Many of the doctors, including Karl Gebhardt, remained committed to defending their work as legitimate science. Even after the camp's partial evacuation, operations continued in smaller facilities set up within Germany. Similarly, experiments from Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler-Struthof were relocated to camps such as Mauthausen and Dachau. This redistribution of personnel and equipment created a fragmented but persistent network of mobile laboratories operating within a collapsing regime. The ethical collapse of medicine was mirrored by the logistical collapse of the Nazi state, yet the system structure, its hierarchies, reporting channels, and scientific rhetoric remained remarkably intact. Even in the final months, the SS medical department continued to issue memoranda emphasizing scientific discipline and the protection of valuable research materials. In March 1945, a conference in Berlin brought together surviving medical officers to discuss post-war continuity. They argued that German science must survive beyond political change, revealing an astonishing belief in the separability of their work from the crimes of the regime. As Allied forces liberated camps across Europe, the scale of medical atrocities became evident. At Bergen-Belsen, British and Canadian soldiers discovered piles of corpses alongside makeshift medical stations used for typhus testing. In Dachau, American troops found the remnants of decompression chambers and ice tanks, as well as files detailing experiments conducted under Luftwaffe supervision. At Mauthausen, Austrian and Czech survivors provided testimony about poison gas tests and forced drug trials. The liberated camps functioned as open-air archives of a system that had blurred every line between science and extermination. The immediate aftermath brought attempts by many perpetrators to conceal or reframe their actions. Some destroyed notes and samples. Others disguised themselves as field doctors or civilian researchers. A few attempted to barter their expertise to the Allies, offering to share their experimental results in exchange for immunity. Several Luftwaffe doctors, including those involved in aviation and freezing research, argued that their data were of strategic value for Western militaries preparing for future conflicts. These claims initiated the first post-war controversies over the use of data obtained through inhumane experimentation. When the war officially ended in May 1945, the scientific infrastructure of the Reich lay in ruins, but its legacy persisted in captured documents and surviving personnel. Allied occupation authorities quickly realized that medical crimes had been committed on an unprecedented scale. Between May and August 1945, teams from the U.S. Army Medical Corps, British Royal Army Medical Services, and Soviet medical units compiled inventories of research facilities, seizing equipment, and interviewing surviving German scientists. Their findings revealed the global scope of the Nazi medical establishment, an apparatus supported by universities, corporations, and military agencies across the continent. The final collapse of the Reich did not bring closure, but exposure. The detailed records left behind by its doctors and administrators formed a mirror of the regime itself, methodical, bureaucratic, and utterly detached from human consequence. In these closing months, the contradiction at the heart of Nazi medicine reached its clearest form. A system that had claimed to serve life through science had instead perfected death through procedure. The war was over, but the evidence it left behind ensured that the reckoning, both legal and moral, had only just begun. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, Allied authorities confronted an extraordinary challenge: how to prosecute crimes that had been committed under the cover of medical science. The discovery of experimental facilities, clinical records, and eyewitness testimonies revealed not isolated acts of cruelty, but a coordinated state-sponsored system of human experimentation. Yet, the complexity of these crimes, conducted under medical supervision, justified through official channels, and documented in scientific language, required new legal and moral frameworks to define accountability. The post-war trials that followed became not only a search for justice, but also a foundational moment in the redefinition of medical ethics and human rights in the modern world. The first investigations began even before the end of the war. Allied intelligence units, particularly the U.S. Army's Medical Intelligence Division, gathered reports from liberated camps and interrogated captured German medical officers. At Dachau, Buchenwald, and Ravensbrück, detailed evidence was collected, including experimental logs, autopsy reports, and photographic documentation. American and British investigators noted the bureaucratic structure of the operations. Experiments were authorized by official directives, reported to higher authorities, and funded through military or industrial contracts. This documentation established that the atrocities were not spontaneous acts by rogue doctors, but components of an organized state policy. The formal judicial process began with the establishment of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in November 1945. Although the main trial focused on major war criminals, it soon became clear that a separate proceeding was necessary to address the medical crimes specifically. Thus, the doctor's trial, officially United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al., commenced in December 1946. The defendants included 23 physicians and administrators, among them Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, Karl Gebhardt, former SS surgeon, Herta Oberhäuser, the only female defendant, and Siegfried Ruf and Hermann Becker-Freising of the Luftwaffe's aviation medicine program. The charges against them encompassed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and participation in a common plan to commit murder and torture under the guise of medical research. The prosecution's case, supported by extensive documentation and survivor testimony, outlined experiments involving freezing, malaria, infection, seawater consumption, high-altitude pressure testing, and sterilization. Witnesses described procedures in detail, often recalling the deaths of fellow prisoners and the indifferent professionalism of their captors. One of the most striking features of the trial was the defendants' insistence on scientific legitimacy. Many argued that their work was consistent with wartime medical necessity, comparing their experiments to human trials conducted in other countries. The tribunal rejected these arguments, emphasizing that consent and humanity were fundamental principles of medicine. The verdict, delivered in August 1947, resulted in 7 death sentences, including those for Brandt, Gebhardt, and Victor Brack. Others received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. Beyond individual punishment, the trial's broader outcome was the articulation of a new standard for medical ethics, the Nuremberg Code. Drafted by the judges, this code set forth 10 principles governing medical research on human subjects, with voluntary consent as its cornerstone. It declared that scientific progress could never justify disregard for human dignity or safety, and that any experiment involving human beings must prioritize the subject's welfare above all else. While the Nuremberg Code represented a moral and legal milestone, its application was inconsistent. During the early Cold War years, Allied governments often prioritized strategic interests over ethical prosecution. Some German scientists who had participated in wartime research were recruited into Western and Soviet programs through initiatives such as Operation Paperclip and its Soviet equivalents. Their expertise in aviation medicine, chemical warfare, and biology was deemed too valuable to waste. As a result, many escaped accountability, resuming careers in scientific and military institutions in both East and West. The contrast between the public condemnation at Nuremberg and the quiet integration of former perpetrators into post-war research underscored the tension between justice and pragmatism. Nevertheless, the doctor's trial had a profound and lasting influence on global medical ethics. Its documentation provided the first systematic analysis of crimes committed in the name of science. The revelations shaped subsequent international agreements, including the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and later declarations on human experimentation adopted by the World Medical Association. The trial also forced physicians and researchers worldwide to confront uncomfortable questions about their profession's vulnerability to political ideology. German medical associations, universities, and research institutions began slow processes of internal reckoning, though genuine acknowledgement of complicity would not emerge until decades later. The trial's cultural impact was equally significant. The image of the physician, once synonymous with healing and progress, had been permanently altered. The revelations from Nuremberg demonstrated that science, detached from ethics, could become an instrument of systematic cruelty. The meticulous records kept by Nazi doctors, intended to legitimize their work, instead became evidence of their crimes. This paradox, the transformation of scientific documentation into proof of inhumanity, defined how history would remember the medical establishment of the Third Reich. By the late 1940s, as Germany was divided and Reconstruction began, the remnants of the Nazi medical system were gradually dismantled. Institutions implicated in experimentation were closed or reorganized under Allied supervision. Yet the legacy of their work remained embedded in scientific archives, publications, and data that continued to influence post-war research. Some of the material was used by Allied agencies studying hypothermia and aviation physiology, reigniting debates over whether data derived from immoral experiments could ever be ethically applied. The Nuremberg Code sought to answer that question by establishing principles rather than prohibitions, a reminder that the lessons of the past depended not only on punishment, but on vigilance and moral discipline in the pursuit of knowledge. Thus, the post-war reckoning of Nazi medicine was both a legal process and a moral inquiry. It established the framework through which modern science would define its limits, balancing discovery with responsibility. The doctor's trial did not end the story of medical complicity. Rather, it marked the point at which the world began to recognize that cruelty, when justified as research, required not only punishment, but constant remembrance. In the years following the Nuremberg verdicts, the legacy of Nazi medical experimentation entered a complex phase of reflection, concealment, and selective remembrance. The moral clarity established by the doctor's trial was soon complicated by political realities. The onset of the Cold War divided the world into opposing blocs, and both sides sought to exploit Germany's scientific expertise. The same doctors who had been part of the Reich's vast network of research institutions became valuable assets in the new global competition for military and technological supremacy. Justice, ethics, and historical truth often yielded to strategic necessity. In the Western zones of occupation, many scientists avoided prosecution or benefited from lenient sentences. Several of those convicted at Nuremberg were released early during the 1950s. Hertha Oberhäuser, the only female defendant, sentenced to 20 years for her role in Ravensbrück surgical experiments, was freed in 1952 and resumed medical practice in West Germany before being exposed by former victims years later. Others, like Siegfried Ruf and Hermann Becker-Freising, who had overseen Luftwaffe hypoxia and high-altitude research, were employed in post-war aeromedical institutions. The U.S. Air Force and other Western agencies showed interest in their data, particularly regarding pilot endurance and hypothermia. Information derived directly from concentration camp experiments. This pragmatic use of ethically tainted research highlighted the contradiction between moral condemnation and practical exploitation. Through Operation Paperclip and parallel initiatives, dozens of German scientists with connections to wartime experimentation were relocated to the United States, where they contributed to aerospace medicine, pharmacology, and biological research. Their pasts were often sanitized in official documents to facilitate their integration into Cold War scientific programs. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pursued a similar policy, transferring captured German doctors and scientists to work in military and medical laboratories across Eastern Europe. In both blocs, the knowledge produced by the Third Reich, regardless of its origins, became part of the intellectual foundation of post-war science. Within Germany itself, the process of reckoning was uneven and often delayed. In West Germany, denazification initially targeted prominent political and military leaders, but rarely extended deeply into the scientific and medical professions. Many physicians who had served in the SS or conducted wartime research resumed university positions or established private practices. The West German Medical Association and professional journals avoided confronting the past directly, focusing instead on rebuilding medical infrastructure. Only a few voices, primarily from survivors and emerging historians, called for full acknowledgement of complicity. In East Germany, the socialist regime condemned Nazi crimes as products of fascist capitalism, emphasizing ideological rather than professional accountability. This framing allowed many former Nazi doctors to continue working under new political affiliations, provided they declared loyalty to the state. During the 1950s and 1960s, public discussion of Nazi medicine largely disappeared from mainstream discourse. War crimes trials faded from memory, replaced by narratives of economic recovery and national rehabilitation. Yet, beneath this silence, fragments of evidence continued to surface. In 1960, the capture of Adolf Eichmann and the subsequent trial in Jerusalem reignited global interest in the mechanisms of the Holocaust. Among the materials revisited were the medical records and testimonies from the Nuremberg proceedings. Scholars began re-examining the structure of Nazi medical institutions, linking the euthanasia program, concentration camp experiments, and racial hygiene policies into a single continuum of biopolitical control. This period also saw the emergence of new ethical debates within international science. The World Medical Association's 1964 Declaration of Helsinki built directly upon the Nuremberg Code, refining principles for clinical research on human subjects. It introduced concepts of informed consent, independent review, and scientific necessity. However, even as global medical ethics evolved, the full integration of these standards into practice was gradual. Some Western institutions continued to reference data from Nazi experiments, particularly in fields like hypothermia and aviation physiology. Journals debated whether using such data constituted complicity or whether ignoring it meant abandoning potentially valuable information. These discussions reflected a broader struggle to reconcile moral principles with scientific utility, a dilemma born directly from the legacy of Nazi medicine. In Germany, the process of remembrance slowly gathered momentum during the 1970s. The publication of works by historians such as Alexander Mitscherlich, who had served as an observer at the Nuremberg trials, began to expose the depth of medical involvement in the regime. His study, Doctors of Infamy, became one of the first comprehensive analyses of how professional institutions facilitated crimes in the name of research. Student movements and new generations of scholars demanded accountability from universities that had employed former Nazi doctors. Memorials began to appear at sites of former asylums and hospitals involved in euthanasia programs. Survivors' testimonies, once marginalized, became central to the narrative. Meanwhile, the global understanding of human experimentation expanded in light of other ethical failures. The exposure of unethical research in democratic nations, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study in the United States, demonstrated that the issues revealed at Nuremberg were not confined to totalitarian systems. The principles established after 1947 now served as tools for criticizing abuses worldwide, reinforcing the universality of the lessons derived from Nazi atrocities. The science of cruelty had forced the world to recognize the thin line separating research from exploitation, when ethics were subordinated to ideology or ambition. By the late 1970s, both German states began integrating the history of Nazi medicine into educational curricula. Archives were opened, exhibitions organized, and former victims officially recognized. Yet, full acknowledgement remained incomplete. Many perpetrators died before facing justice, and the institutions that had once supported them continued to exist, often rebranded under new names. Still, the public discourse was changing. Medicine was no longer viewed solely as a domain of healing, but as a field capable of deep moral corruption when divorced from human values. The post-war decades revealed that the impact of Nazi medical experiments extended far beyond the individuals who conducted them. Their legacy reshaped the ethics of global science, the responsibilities of physicians, and the boundaries of state power over human life. The silence that followed the war had been replaced by debate, and that debate, though often uncomfortable, ensured that the lessons drawn from the laboratories and camps of the Third Reich would not fade entirely from collective memory. By the 1980s and 1990s, the long process of historical reckoning with Nazi medical crimes entered a new and more critical phase. The generation that had lived through the war was fading, and younger scholars, journalists, and survivors' descendants demanded a more complete confrontation with the role of medicine under the Third Reich. The narrative of individual guilt began to expand into one of systemic complicity, an acknowledgement that the medical establishment as a whole, not merely a few notorious figures, had participated in the ideological and bureaucratic structures that made mass experimentation and euthanasia possible. This shift transformed the study of Nazi medicine from a question of criminal history into one of institutional and professional ethics. In West Germany, this period marked the beginning of official acknowledgement from professional organizations. The German Medical Association, which had long avoided direct responsibility, began issuing statements recognizing its involvement in Nazi crimes. In 1988, it formally apologized for the participation of physicians in the sterilization, euthanasia, and concentration camp programs. This admission followed years of public pressure and independent investigations that had revealed the extent to which post-war continuity had shielded many perpetrators. University archives were opened, and research committees were formed to trace the careers of medical faculty who had served in the SS or conducted experiments on prisoners. At institutions such as the University of Heidelberg and the Charité in Berlin, memorial plaques were installed to honor victims of medical research and forced sterilization. Simultaneously, the rediscovery and publication of primary sources deepened understanding of how the medical system functioned under Nazism. Historians analyzed correspondence between university deans, SS medical departments, and pharmaceutical companies, demonstrating the seamless integration of scientific institutions into the machinery of state control. Newly declassified files from the Nuremberg trials revealed that the scale of research had been even broader than initially assumed. Studies once believed to have been confined to camps were found to have extended into civilian hospitals, clinics, and psychiatric institutions across the Reich. The boundary between the front line of science and the infrastructure of killing had been virtually non-existent. This wave of scholarship also challenged the post-war myth of scientific neutrality. Many German doctors after 1945 had claimed that they were motivated by scientific curiosity rather than ideology. However, archival evidence showed that participation in eugenics, sterilization, and experimentation was not coerced but actively pursued by many within the profession. Ideology provided a moral framework that justified cruelty as service to the collective health of the Volk. The medical community's acceptance of this logic revealed how easily professional ethics could be redefined under political pressure. In the global context, the ethical legacy of the Nuremberg Code gained renewed significance. The 1980s saw an expansion of medical research involving human subjects in developing countries, raising new concerns about consent and exploitation. References to Nazi experiments appeared in debates about bioethics, clinical trials, and organ transplantation. International conferences invoked Nuremberg as a moral benchmark, warning that technological progress without ethical oversight could replicate the abuses of the past in new forms. The science of cruelty had become a universal cautionary symbol, not merely a German tragedy, but a warning about the fragility of human rights in scientific practice. In Germany, memorial culture expanded beyond the courtroom and the university. Former hospitals and asylums that had participated in the euthanasia program were converted into educational centers. The Hadamar Memorial, opened in 1983, became one of the first sites dedicated to victims of medical killing. It presented documentation, photographs, and personal accounts illustrating how physicians transformed ordinary healthcare institutions into centers of systematic murder. Similar projects followed at Grafeneck, Hartheim, and Brandenburg. These memorials emphasized the bureaucratic nature of the crimes. The doctors' signatures, official seals, and standardized death certificates that made killing appear administrative rather than criminal. Visitors were confronted not with sensational horror, but with the cold normality of procedure. In academia, interdisciplinary research deepened the connection between Nazi medicine and broader themes of modernity and biopolitics. Scholars such as Henry Friedlander and Robert Proctor argued that the Nazi medical system represented an extreme manifestation of a modern state's attempt to manage life through science. Concepts of racial hygiene and euthanasia, they showed, were not uniquely German inventions, but distorted versions of ideas already circulating in international medical and eugenic discourse. This realization complicated the moral geography of responsibility. It revealed that while the Reich's crimes were unparalleled in scale and intent, the intellectual foundations of its medical ideology had transnational roots. During the 1990s, public debate intensified around the question of reparation and acknowledgement. Survivors of Nazi experiments, many of whom had been excluded from earlier compensation programs, began seeking formal recognition and financial restitution. The German government, under pressure from advocacy groups and international organizations, eventually established funds for surviving victims of medical and eugenic persecution. The payments were symbolic rather than substantial, but they represented an important shift, an official recognition that the suffering inflicted in the name of science had long been minimized. At the same time, the controversy over the use of data obtained through Nazi experiments re-emerged. In the United States and Europe, some researchers continued to cite results from hypothermia and pressure chamber studies, arguing that the information could not ethically be discarded if it could save lives. Opponents countered that using such data legitimized its origins and perpetuated the dehumanization of its victims. Scientific journals and ethics committees debated the issue extensively, ultimately agreeing that such data could only be referenced in the context of explicit condemnation and historical explanation. This consensus underscored the ongoing influence of Nuremberg principles, decades after the trial. By the end of the century, the study of Nazi medical crimes had become a central part of Holocaust scholarship and bioethical education worldwide. Medical schools introduced courses on ethics that began not with abstract theory, but with the history of the camps. Exhibitions and documentaries presented the doctors not as monsters, but as professionals who surrendered judgment to ideology, demonstrating how ordinary ambition could become an instrument of atrocity. The historical distance allowed a clearer understanding of how cruelty was institutionalized through the language of science. Thus, 50 years after the end of the war, the full scope of Nazi medicine had finally entered public consciousness. Its legacy was no longer confined to the courtroom or the archive. It became a permanent component of medical and moral education, a reminder that progress, stripped of conscience, could transform healing into harm, and that the same instruments used to study life could just as easily be turned toward its calculated destruction. By the beginning of the 21st century, the reckoning with the medical crimes of the Third Reich had evolved from a process of exposure into one of enduring remembrance and ethical vigilance. What had once been buried beneath silence or rationalized through professional detachment was now an essential part of global historical and scientific consciousness. The science of cruelty, as it came to be called in scholarly literature, had ceased to be understood merely as a historical aberration. Instead, it was recognized as a warning about the potential of any scientific system to lose its moral anchor when subordinated to ideology, nationalism, or bureaucratic obedience. The lessons of the Reich's medical experiments had transcended their time, becoming central to debates on bioethics, human rights, and the moral limits of research in the modern age. In Germany, the process of institutional reflection reached maturity. Medical universities that had once ignored their wartime past began incorporating comprehensive documentation projects into their curricula. The Charité in Berlin, the University of Heidelberg, and the University of Vienna published extensive studies tracing their faculty's roles in eugenics, forced sterilization, and human experimentation. Museums and archives collaborated with descendants of victims to restore names to those who had been erased from medical records. Anatomical collections built during the Nazi era were re-examined. Human remains used for teaching or research were identified and given proper burials. The act of naming, once used to categorize and dehumanize, became an instrument of restitution. The broader European academic community followed suit. Conferences and memorial symposia brought together historians, ethicists, and physicians from across the continent to discuss how the Nazi experience continued to inform modern medical ethics. Special attention was given to the complicity of ordinary practitioners, the thousands of doctors, nurses, and administrators who had facilitated policies of sterilization and euthanasia. Their participation, often motivated by careerism or bureaucratic conformity rather than fanaticism, demonstrated that atrocities were not the work of isolated individuals, but of entire professional systems that lost their ethical compass. This realization reshaped how medicine was taught and practiced. Ethical codes were no longer presented as static rules, but as safeguards requiring constant self-examination and resistance to authority. Internationally, the influence of the Nuremberg Code and the subsequent Declaration of Helsinki deepened as bioethics became a distinct discipline. Universities across the world established ethics committees to evaluate medical and psychological research involving human subjects. The concept of informed consent, first articulated in reaction to Nazi experiments, evolved into a universal standard in clinical practice. Meanwhile, genetic engineering, cloning, and biotechnology raised new moral questions that echoed the past. Who defines the boundaries of legitimate science? Can technological progress be separated from its ethical implications? Each generation returned to the example of Nazi medicine as the ultimate cautionary tale, a point at which progress and barbarism had become indistinguishable. The cultural and educational integration of this history also expanded. Holocaust memorials increasingly included sections on medical crimes, emphasizing that genocide had begun not in the death camps, but in hospitals and laboratories under the language of public health and racial hygiene. Exhibitions in Berlin, Vienna, and Washington displayed the instruments of experimentation, physicians' reports, and victims' testimonies. Films and documentaries portrayed the transformation of medicine into a mechanism of control. In classrooms, medical students studied the ethical failures of the Reich as part of professional formation, learning that knowledge without empathy could become an engine of destruction. Despite these advances in remembrance, unresolved questions remained. Some data derived from Nazi research still existed in medical archives, their scientific validity uncertain, but their moral burden undeniable. The debate over whether such material should be preserved or destroyed persisted. Many institutions chose to keep the documents sealed, accessible only for historical study, not scientific use. The dilemma symbolized the enduring conflict between knowledge and conscience. Whether erasing the evidence would dishonor the victims or preserving it would risk perpetuating the legacy of dehumanization. Survivor testimony continued to play a crucial role in shaping this discourse. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the remaining victims of Nazi experiments gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and participated in educational initiatives. Their voices shifted the narrative from that of perpetrators to that of those who endured. They described not only physical suffering, but also the lasting trauma of being treated as objects of study. Their stories restored individuality to what had been rendered statistical and brought emotional resonance to the abstract moral lessons of Nuremberg. As these survivors passed away, their testimonies became permanent archives of warning for future generations. In the scientific community, the history of Nazi medicine came to represent the necessity of transparency and accountability. Ethical oversight boards, peer review systems, and patient advocacy networks were built around the recognition that abuses flourish in secrecy. Every modern medical institution, from clinical laboratories to pharmaceutical companies, inherited, whether acknowledged or not, the responsibility to guard against the reemergence of structures that had enabled cruelty under the guise of research. The very language of bioethics, emphasizing autonomy, dignity, and consent, stands as a conscious reversal of the principles that governed the Reich's medical regime. By the second decade of the new century, the study of Nazi medical experiments had become both historical and philosophical. Historians continued to uncover details, but the larger question had shifted: how societies remember and how they translate remembrance into ethical action. The story of these crimes now serves as a mirror, reflecting the dangers of moral disengagement in all forms of science and governance. It demonstrates that atrocity does not arise from ignorance, but from the corruption of knowledge. When the healer becomes the instrument of policy, and the language of care becomes the language of power. Today, nearly 80 years after the liberation of the camps, the scientific world continues to live in the shadow of these lessons. Every code of ethics, every signed consent form, every research review stands as an implicit memorial to those who suffered in the name of medicine. The legacy of the Nazi experiments endures not because of what it achieved, but because of what it destroyed: the trust between knowledge and humanity. The true measure of progress lies not in discovery, but in the capacity to remember, to question, and to ensure that the pursuit of science never again demands the sacrifice of human dignity.